The horror franchise that refused to die. Resident Evil didn't just survive the test of time, it suplexed it right on its damn noggin. What started as a clunky, cheesy zombie game clawed its ways into gaming royalty, and it didn't do that by playing it safe. It adapted, got weird, flopped, and came back swinging harder each time. When RE9 was revealed for the first time at this year's Summer Games Fest, the pop from the crowd and reactions online when the RPD's ruins were shown on screen sent more shivers down my spine than the reveal itself.
Everyone's going.
30 years on, after trials and tribulations, the franchise is stronger than it's ever been, and the people, including myself, are still wanting more. But how? While many long-running gaming franchises, mostly family-friendly or fighting games, have celebrated 30 years or more, no other survival horror series has even come close to that milestone. Other notable survival horror franchises either took long hiatuses, had irregular releases, or faded into obscurity. Resident Evil stands alone as the genre's powerhouse, maintaining the crown and its loyal fan base while gaining millions of more fans through constant reinvention. Resident Evil should have been a corpse by now, and to understand how the series survived and stayed relevant to this day, we have to go back to where it all began. Before Resident Evil 1, there was this other lesser-known Capcom game released in 1989 called Sweet Home, a Japanese-only Famicom game based on a horror film of the same name. Sweet Home laid the foundation for Resident Evil in terms of survival horror mechanics, limited resources, inventory management, mansion exploration, and backtracking through an immersively spooky environment. The director of Sweet Home, Takuro Fujiwara, came up with the initial concept of Resident Evil. He wanted to create a 3D horror game that captured the atmospheric tension of Sweet Home but modernized for the PlayStation. Fujiwara pitched the idea as a kind of spiritual successor to Sweet Home, and once it got greenlit, he handed the reins over to a young director named Shinji Mikami. Mikami, ironically enough, wasn't a huge fan of horror. He stated he never liked being scared, but still took the project face on and studied horror films like The Shining, The Exorcist, and Dawn of the Dead. His whole idea was to make the game feel like a playable horror film and wanted to emphasize tension, pacing, and deliberate control. Early concepts even explored a first-person view, but due to hardware limitations, they instead went with fixed camera angles. That one decision gave the game its signature look and cemented its identity. The static shots didn't just add tension of not knowing what lurked around a corner, they made Resident Evil feel cinematic in a way no other game at the time could have pulled off. Then there were the controls, which were infamously janky that heightened vulnerability, making every movement feel weighty. Add to that the puzzle-solving elements, strange doors requiring strange keys, and solving riddles, which made exploration feel rewarding rather than aimless and monotonous. And of course, the enemy designs. This wasn't just an ordinary spooky little zombie game, it had a random-ass roster of monsters that kept people constantly on their toes. From bad doggies busting through windows, to giant snakes, spiders, and lizard monstrosities called hunters. The super limited resources combined with such a wide range of enemies made every encounter feel like life and death, reinforcing the survival horror experience that Resident Evil mastered. All of these elements combined made Resident Evil feel like more than just a game. It was an experience that balanced horror, strategy, and storytelling in a way no one had seen before, catapulting it into gaming history. During its initial release period, it was a massive success, selling nearly 3 million copies. It didn't just popularize survival horror, it created it, and kicked off what would become the genre's blueprint for years to come. After the release of the first game, Capcom began development on a sequel almost immediately. By the time RE2 launched in 1998, the franchise had already become a household name. A year later, RE3 Nemesis dropped, and by then the series was booming. Shinji Mikami even got to run it back with remaking RE1, this time with better tech, more experience, and way more creative control, and the result was one of the greatest remakes ever made. Capcom also tried expanding with numerous spin-offs like Survivor, Dead Aim, Code Veronica, Gaiden, and Outbreak Files 1 and 2. While some were well received, others struggled to capture the magic of the originals. Then by the mid-2000s, after the high of this phenomenon started to wear off, the series started to show signs of creative plateau. The core gameplay formula, tank controls, fixed camera angles, and slower pacing was starting to feel dated as the expectations evolved alongside the gaming landscape. New games with fluid controls, dynamic camera work, and faster-paced gameplay was the new craze. On top of that, survival horror itself was now becoming even more niche than it already was. Many players started to complain that Resident Evil was too slow or clunky compared to emerging genres, while new horror games experimented with different approaches. The internal team at Capcom recognized their own franchise was at risk of stagnation if they didn't do something to innovate. Enter Shinji Mikami, the director of the first game and its go-to remake. He returned to the franchise for one last ride and pushed for a bold reinvention. Over the shoulder was where it's at. This point of view was almost unheard of in the survival horror genre at the time. RE4 was the first to fully embrace and pioneer the tight over-the-shoulder camera in horror. This change didn't just improve the action, it changed how players can experience fear. For the first time, horror felt immediate. It struck a unique balance between cinematic control and player agency that first-person or fixed camera angles didn't quite have at the time. The camera itself narrowed your vision just enough to keep you anxious while giving you full control in a way that felt revolutionary. It was one of a kind for its time, especially within the survival horror genre. Plenty of action games had responsive third-person cameras, and horror games had atmosphere and fear, but RE4 merged the two in a way that hadn't been done before. It not only saved the series, it reshaped the entire gaming landscape, setting a new blueprint and influencing games from Dead Space to God of War 2018. But setting the standard doesn't come without its caveats. Once something hits peak, the only way left is down. The shift towards faster-paced, action-heavy gameplay that RE4 popularized steered the series away from its survival horror roots and started a wave of some of the shittiest games this series has produced. Resident Evil 4 sold over 1.5 million copies on the GameCube alone, a number that more than doubled when it was ported on the PS2 later that same year. If one thing was clear at that time, it was that action sells, and what started as a ballsy reinvention spiraled into overindulgence. Gone were the days of methodical pacing, creeping dread, and resource management. Elements of what made Resident Evil were now gradually being replaced by spectacle, more enemies, bigger body counts, and more explosions. Tension was out. Big, meaty testosterone was in. RE5 took everything from RE4 and dialed it up. The sense of isolation and vulnerability, elements crucial to survival horror, no longer existed once you were controlling a juiced up Chris Redfield shooting a goddamn M2 Browning like Rambo at El Gigante. Environments were now a lot brighter, combat went down around every corner, and enemy design leaned more into big spectacles than fear. But personally, I loved RE5, I'll come out and say it. I played it when I was 10, and I have core memories waking up on summer mornings and immediately booting this up. It had so many dumb iconic moments. Wesker was the coolest villain I've ever seen, and overall it was just so much fun to play. But it wasn't really Resident Evil, and it felt like something important was missing from this game. The survival horror soul was starting to fade, and it didn't get any better from then on. By Resident Evil 6, Capcom just said fuck it and tried to be 4 different experiences in one, with campaigns starring Leon, Chris, Jake Wesker, and Ada. Each story aimed to appeal to different markets: horror, shooter, action thriller, and espionage. They tried appealing to every audience, instead ironically alienating most. The result was a bloated, incoherent, unfortunate mess that couldn't commit to one thing and was just deeply out of touch with what made RE special. Capcom just tried doing too much and completely abandoned subtlety, I guess. Instead of going back to the drawing board and refining on what worked in RE4, Capcom chose to double down on spectacle, resulting in the most divisive entry in the franchise. Even though it sold like millions of copies, RE6 was a turning point. The critics and the people fully believed the series had lost its way, and the mainline games weren't the only problem. Capcom also flooded the market with shitty spin-offs that felt like desperate attempts to cash in on shooter trends. Operation Raccoon City tried its hand as a squad-based third-person shooter, and Umbrella Corps that didn't even have Resident Evil in its title because it was that dishonorable. At this point, the identity was cooked and barely recognizable, a collection of experiments gone wrong trying to imitate better games at the time. By the mid-2010s, Capcom was left with the hard truth reminiscent of an earlier point. If Resident Evil was going to survive the next era, it couldn't keep chasing the market and its trends. It had to rediscover what it truly was. If you're a fan, do you remember where you were in 2016 when out of nowhere we were hit with this? Capcom kept this project and its direction under wraps. Everything we were seeing on screen during that reveal was so different from every previous entry that nobody thought that whatever this thing is could actually be an RE game. It was one of the most hyped up and talked about reveals of the entire event. It not only reintroduced RE with a new vision, but also shocked everyone who had written off the franchise. Just like in 2005, Capcom somehow did it again and reinvented RE a second time, creating another beautiful piece of horror that felt fresh in every way. RE7 dropped the flashy mechanics, bigger than life global stories, and its iconic characters for a much more intimate experience. The setting was a musty, dank, and small dilapidated plantation house centered in the swamps of Louisiana. The cast of characters was 99% unknown. The story was told from the perspective of a regular, honest working man, and most importantly, the game was played in first person. Another risky shift in perspective. For 2 decades, RE has been defined by its third-person camera angles, whether it was fixed or over the shoulder. The first-person view was a gamble that could have alienated fans even further, but instead, it pulled us all closer. Very close. RE7 is the scariest RE game so far, no question. It brought everything back down to its roots and reintroduced the classic survival horror elements: limited resources, annoying inventory management, puzzle solving, and well-designed environments that rewarded exploration. And while it was fresh, it didn't betray the series' legacy at all. It truly honored it. You could feel the atmosphere of the Spencer Monster Mansion and the Baker House with all of its quirks. The comfort of the classic RE safe room returned, and the pacing was slow and deliberate. It was a return to form, and it was all about vulnerability and fear of the unknown, dread, tension. The game made you feel small again, and in doing so, it felt like Resident Evil had finally found its soul again. This was also the first game to introduce Capcom's new RE engine, driving the point home that this is a new era not only for the franchise but for the company in general. At the time, Capcom wasn't just having an identity crisis with RE. Other major franchises were either dormant or struggling. They tried their hand at rebooting Devil May Cry, which bombed. Street Fighter V was dog shit on launch. People thought Dead Rising 3 was bad until Dead Rising 4 said watch this, and Mega Man was MIA. Then RE7 came and was a financial and reputational turning point for the company. The game sold over 11 million copies across all platforms, making it one of the highest selling Capcom games to date. That's great and all, but the real success was winning the people back and restoring confidence to this beautifully horrific franchise. This game had a ripple effect across Capcom's broader catalog. Devil May Cry returned to form, Monster Hunter World had complete global saturation, and Capcom fast-tracked remakes of older RE games that haven't been touched in decades. After the swamp, Capcom went full steam into its next phase, remakes.
Don't shoot! Get down!
Since RE1 was already remade in 2002, which still holds up to this day by the way, the next game that needed a facelift was good old RE2. The fans wanted it, Capcom teased it, boom, you looking for this? RE was officially back. RE2 proved that Capcom had full intentions in bringing the love back to this beloved franchise by listening to the people and giving the people what they wanted. Instead of remaking 2 in the same way as Remake, it was more of a reimagining. Fixed camera angles won't be making a comeback. This time we're back to over the shoulder, but unlike during most of the action era, tension was brought back for the first time since RE4. Even more so since rookie cop Leon and college student Claire couldn't go around stunning things than roundhousing them. Resident Evil 2 was strictly boots to ground survival horror goodness. It felt just like the original, but through a modern lens. If we ignore the camera perspective, Capcom stayed fully faithful to the original and even added a little more sauce in the same way Shinji Mikami added Lisa to the RE1 remake. Mr. X was already a menace, then Capcom turned this dude into a fucking powerhouse Terminator with PTSD-inducing sound effects. RE2 was only the second game that used the new RE engine, and it really flexed its capabilities. The lighting and aesthetics were absolutely beautiful. It was clean, polished, and still terrifying. Everything was super detailed, and it was like experiencing the RPD for the first time all over again. Just way wetter and darker this time. RE2 ended up selling over 15 million copies, landing it at Capcom's third highest selling game of all time. It was such a massive hit that the hype immediately shifted towards one question: so when's RE3 remake coming out next? Well, only just a year later. Boom, you looking for this? Yeah, the RE3 remake was kinda mid. Unlike RE2, which felt like a modern but faithful reimagining of the original, this one didn't feel anything like classic RE3. They cut a lot of content from the OG without substituting any of it. Complete sections were left out entirely, like the clock tower. They cut out the branching path aspect where players would have to make decisions during several points in the game. Jill was supposed to be at the RPD instead of Carlos, which would have led to this iconic cutscene with Nemesis. And speaking of Nemi, that dude was barely even in the game. RE2's stalker system had me clenched up. RE3's should have been just as good or even better, but nope. Nemesis only stalks you during the Raccoon City area, and most of his encounters are just scripted chase sequences. That was probably my biggest disappointment with this remake. They made Nemesis a fucking jobber who could get dropped with a single nade. All of this cut content and nothing to replace it made this remake so bare bones and linear that its short runtime felt even shorter. In the end, I still had a somewhat fun experience with it, but it just felt like DLC. Capcom also had to throw in some classic Capcomisms and tried hopping on the asymmetrical trend with Resistance, which was bundled with RE3 whether you wanted it or not. It was fine for a weekend, but nothing worth writing home about. Still, within just 3 years, Capcom dropped RE7 and 2 remakes back to back. And while RE3 and its multiplayer spinoff didn't slap as hard, RE7 and RE2 remake had already breathed new life into the franchise. Going into the 2020s, the series wasn't just surviving anymore, it was alive again, and the story keeps going. By the time we hit 2021, RE was booming again. 7 brought back the horror, 2 brought back the fans, and 3 was just there. The momentum was going strong, and I was on the edge of my seat wondering where they would go next. Then, only 2 months after RE3 remake was dropped, RE8 Village was revealed, and just a year later, it was out. RE Village picks up right where 7 left off. Ethan's back, Mia's back. This time they got a baby. Chris crashes the party, shoots Ethan's baby mama, and yoinks the baby. And that kicks off a completely wild journey through one of the weirdest and most creative RE games in years. The game starts off a little slow and rough, but once you get settled in the village, you're basically in a theme park. Every major location feels completely different from the last, like rides at Disneyland, from gothic castles to robo factories to of course haunted houses. Capcom just seemed like they wanted to dump their load on horror horror cliches, and somehow they made it work. The pacing keeps it moving, each area has its own vibe, and there's always something new around the corner. It wasn't as grounded as RE7, but it made up for that with variety, style, and some huge set pieces. The game was a hit right out the gate. It sold really well, it reviewed well, it kept most longtime fans happy while also pulling in newer ones. It obviously wasn't perfect and it did have its flaws, but it was still a strong and enjoyable entry in the RE franchise, which kept the momentum going. Ever since RE2 and 3 were remade, the only logical thing next would be the conceptual greatest of the franchise and one of the most influential games ever made, Resident Evil 4. This was one of the most anticipated games for me of all time. RE4 is my favorite game. I grew up on it and pretty much have been running it back at least once annually. I remember the hype leading up to the remake's release being absolutely unreal. Everyone was losing their shit and was nervous as hell. I mean, it's the crown jewel, the most sacred of the series, so obviously the idea of remaking it was playing with fire from the get-go. But the fact that Capcom had me and millions of others by the throat itching at an upcoming RE project after all these years is a testament that RE was truly alive again. But if they wanted to keep the series alive, they would have to not fuck up 4's remake. Thankfully, in the end, it didn't get the RE3 treatment. They invested their all into this masterpiece of a game, and it lived up to it. Shinji Mikami would be proud. The remake's tone was darker, more grounded, the pacing was smoother, and the characters had way more depth. Leon was still a dork with his one-liners, but he had more emotional range this time. Ashley actually felt like a companion and wasn't all up in your ear this time. Lewis's lore was expanded, and Ada was, well, still Ada, I guess. Gameplay wise, it took everything that worked in the OG and fine-tuned it. The movements were so much tighter and the shooting was snappier. They also added a parry element, which the purist in me was skeptical with at first, but it added a whole new layer of skill and made combat more engaging. It was the same wild ride, but just felt like it matured a bit. Even if the remake followed all the story beats and elements of the OG, they're both still two different games that both stand on their own 2 feet. The OG will forever be a classic, and the remake didn't overwrite it at all. The game launched to glowing reviews, millions of copies sold, and widespread love from the core fans. It wasn't perfect, no remake ever is, but it was proof that Resident Evil still had the sauce even 30 years in. By this point, Resident Evil had done the unthinkable. It reinvented itself twice, pulled off multiple critically acclaimed remakes, switched point of views 3 times, and brought one of the most beloved games of all time back into the spotlight without shitting on its legacy. That leaves us to 2025. RE9 Requiem is next up on the block, and now I'm even more eager to see what they got cooking up for RE in the grand scheme of things. I am over here itching for any details and facts, and 9's got me theorizing more than ever before. Unlike 7 and Village, which were mostly in their own little bubble, RE9 makes a return to Raccoon City for the first time since it got bombed. Will Leon return? What about Jill? So many questions that I'll have fun theorizing with on the lead up to its release. Resident Evil is not just important to gaming, it's crucial. This series didn't just define the survival horror genre, it basically invented it. It's done so much to push the needle forward when it comes to horror games, and I'm glad we live in a timeline where it's still going and is being appreciated. I love Resident Evil with all my heart. Looking back, it's given me some of the greatest, most raw moments I've ever felt in any video game ever, and I hope it continues to evolve. But good things never last, and if RE9 flops, and RE goes on another generational L run, and if Capcom isn't able to resuscitate the series again, I will say it's been truly a blast to have experienced the ups and downs of 30 years of Resident Evil.